And, like, I don't think economically we need local first software. Like, we can trudge along with the feudalism of Google cloud services for, probably for a very long time. But I don't want that. I want beautiful software. I want programs that work in harmony with who I am as a person and in harmony with what kind of communities I want to be able to foster.
Welcome to the Local First FM podcast. I'm your host, Johannes Schickling, and I'm a web developer, a startup founder, and love the craft of software engineering. For the past few years, I've been on a journey to build a modern, high-quality music app using web technologies. And in doing so, I've been falling down the rabbit hole of local first software. This podcast is your invitation to join me on that journey. In this episode, I'm speaking to Seph Gentle, a prolific software researcher who's behind projects such as the new Eggwalker paper and ShareJS, one of the oldest local first open source projects. Before, Seph also co-created Google Wave over 10 years ago, which we explore in depth in this episode. Before getting started, also a big thank you to Electric SQL for supporting this podcast. And now my interview with Seph. Hey Seph, so nice to have you on the podcast. I'm a huge fan of your work. I've learned so much from the paper you've recently written about Eggwalker. And the more I dug into your work, the more I realized, oh, wow, you've also been involved in this. So, for example, you've been working on Google Wave like way back, but also on projects such as ShareDB, ShareJS, etc. So welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Thanks. I'm great. It's so wonderful to finally meet you as well. I feel like you're one of these faces that pokes up everywhere. And yeah, it's lovely to meet in person and get to actually chat about all of this stuff.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So I've already mentioned a few projects that you worked on, but maybe you want to give a background for the audience.
No, absolutely. So I guess the story starts way back in, I think it was 2010, 2011. And I was invited onto the super secret at the time project of Google Wave, which was run out of Google. And it was, not many people know this, and I'm sure someone will get in trouble, get mad at me for saying so, but it was a secret even inside Google. So Google was thinking, we've got lots of people who've worked in startups, but we're not a startup anymore. How do we get some of that innovation? And so Google Wave started as this skunkworks project. They didn't even tell Googlers about it, which was a wild thing at the time. And before long, and the original vision to anyone who hasn't tried it out was, if we reinvented email today, what would we want it to look like? What could it do? And so Wave is this almost cross between email and Google Docs and something else, where you can have a conversation, which they called a wave, was a series of messages, but messages could go down. So we could have a series of conversation items. You could also embed messages and embed entire threads inside a comment. So I could write something and you could start a comment thread inside that. And any comment, anything that anyone wrote, anyone could come along and just collaboratively edit it and change it later. So we sort of built this thing not really knowing how it was going to be used, which is a beautiful luxury. And the answer is that lots of people used it for, say like for playing D&D games, and they would put all of the information about the campaign itself at the top of a wave. And then the actual session would be a series of messages, and then they'd start a new wave for the next session. Or say minutes. So you'd have the agenda for a meeting, and then during the meeting, anyone could put in little comment threads about what was actually discussed. And then your minutes for the meeting turn into the agenda. Your agenda turns into the minutes afterwards, because we've now got this collaborative document.
So yeah, I fully remember when Google Wave just first came out. I was still in high school back then. I was 16 and I was like using a few Google products, I think mostly Gmail and maybe a bit of Google Docs to just keep track of my own thoughts. But when Google Wave came out, I was just so curious, and there wasn't really like a real use case I had for it back then, but I got immediately hooked by the novelty of it. And I think it was really the first time where it really clicked for me, like, oh, computers are not just for me, like looking in my single screen here and then sort of asynchronous, yes, I can send an email, etc. But we can in real time collaborate on the same stuff, and that sort of same magic that happens if we're like sitting at the same table and do something together. Now that can sort of be replicated in there. And not only did you build something in a real-time collaborative way, you built it so well. I think Google Wave really set the bar for a long, long, long time what a really like immersive, high-quality web experience could look like. And that was, you mentioned like in 2010. So I think that had a long-lasting impact on my own longing and motivation to go all in on the web.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. I feel like I'm like, oh, I can't take all the credit for Wave. I mean, at peak, there was 60 people working on it, and I came onto the project reasonably late. So, it wasn't my grand vision. And something, though, for this audience you might be fascinated by, we built the entire thing to be, it wasn't local first. That term certainly didn't exist at the time, but it was fully federated. So it worked like email did, with the idea that people could run their own Wave servers. And so you could collaborate within your organization on your Waves. And then the document wouldn't leave your organization unless you explicitly added someone from outside of your organization. Otherwise, it would stay in the four walls of your company and your own servers, which was really, really cool and groundbreaking.
I mean,
And like
hearing
even
that in retrospect doesn't sound very like that's not what I associate with Google these days. Like Google
it's really
typically
not.
builds like a very Google-centric service, take it or leave it. It works really well integrated in the rest of Google services. But going in a more federated, like open protocol direction is not immediate. Maybe this was just a different time back then.
Maybe. I think that Wave was also, it was a weird project inside Google itself. It was run out of Australia in the Sydney office. So, it was like this little project at first about what could be built. And Google's got a funny relationship with openness where you've got, I mean, I agree with you about most of Google's product offerings, but then Google are one of the hugest proponents of the web. And the web, of course, is still fully open. And, as much as people like to complain whenever Google Chrome integrates with Google services, Google at their heart really still does believe in the open web. And, so the question is, could we use that knowledge and that understanding to be able to build more products that work like email does? And of course, again, Google, with Gmail is it's all built on open protocols. So yeah, but no, it was really ambitious and it was a really beautiful product to use. As you say, it introduced lots of people to actually things being real-time and collaborative by default, which I really think is the right default. I told my mum at one point, I spent, a couple of years of my life trying to make, we had a joke that we wanted to make two windows look exactly the same. And, so if you typed in one window, it would just appear on the other screen. And this is a really very difficult problem. And she kind of gave me this quizzical look and said, doesn't it do that already anyway? And, she just never tried and never noticed. But it's really is, like Paul Graham has this question. He says, what feels like it would be obvious, it would be crazy for us not to have in 100 years? And I think about that a lot, of what technology would it be crazy for us not to have, and such that if we could figure out what that technology is, could we build that now and then just have it now? I don't want to have to wait for someone else to invent all of this stuff. Like with Wave, it felt like it was right at the birth of collaborative editing. Google Docs was actually quite new at the time. And believe it or not, Google Docs had a bunch of correctness issues where, if you type certain text and then bolded and then you unplugged your network cable at the right time and everything else, you'd end up converging. You would see something, and if you hit refresh, you'd see a different document on your screen. These problems were still new and we were still figuring them out. But I feel really sad that there's not more software that takes advantage of this cool technology we were working on. Like even things like Figma, and I love Figma for using CRDTs, but you can't run your own Figma. When I open Figma, it's the centralized service. It just happens to be using CRDTs to do collaborative editing. But I feel like it's technology that we can use for so much stuff. And that was kind of part of my like dual joy and sadness in working on Wave. And
Right.
thought,
Yeah, I mean, let's
because
not go to the sad part yet. Ultimately, Google Wave shut down, but I want to hear a bit more about the various aspects you've already mentioned. And I love the framing of Paul Graham in that regard. Like, what would be just obvious to build, and maybe we can also follow up which ideas feel obvious to you now, and maybe that you want to work on that you don't have the time. Let's shelve that for the time being. So not only was Google Wave just like an amazing product experience, like how fluid it felt, etc. And you have to remember, this was like at 2010, where web standards were not at all where they were today. And I'm not sure how strict Google was back then about like browser compatibility, but I remember the experience just feeling phenomenal back then. So what were some of the key challenges making this happen?
I mean, that's very kind of you to say. That wasn't the universal experience, and it depended very much on what browser you had. We had an internal Wave that was like scrolled for a long way of open browser bugs that we'd filed against all of the different web browsers in all sorts of different little edge cases. I mean, for context, we made Google Wave work on, I think it worked on IE 8. It certainly worked on IE 9, which was the version of Internet Explorer at the time. But there was so much that was still, I mean, even still is not standardized, honestly. We had a rich text editing element, and we needed that to work with international characters and internationalization and be able to synchronize with any device on any platform with any browser. So that was tremendously hard. There was a team of about 6 or 7 people just working on the input side. And we had this insane test suite that would test, different keyboards in the office of, for Korean characters and Chinese characters and, European, various different forms, different laptops running different versions of Windows to make sure that we could get everything to synchronize correctly. And we used all of that to try and just make the browser work correctly and work consistently. But from a technology standpoint, we forget now, but this is back in the day before we realized that JavaScript was actually a useful language and kind of nice to write in sometimes. So Google Wave was all written in Java and then compiled from Java to JavaScript via Google Web Toolkit. So we had, I think that when Wave got shut down, eventually, I checked the source tree, and internally we had 1.1 million lines of Java code. And obviously that wasn't all the client-side application, but then that compiled to it was like a 500 kilobyte JavaScript bundle, which these days doesn't seem so large. But at the time, it brought down, mighty web browsers trying to run all of this stuff that we were, trying to do written in Java to be able to solve all of this like front end problem. And then on the back end, operational transform was a new idea. CRDTs were like, I think that they were gleam in some researchers' eyes at the time that we were working, but they were incredibly inefficient. So we tried to build something that was federated and would let multiple servers, multiple users from different organizations all collaboratively edit a document, all built on top of a very old version of operational transform, which some very smart people on the team managed to get to work. But it was incredibly new. And I learned a huge amount from working on that, which has kept me busy for the last decade and change, honestly, of trying to figure out how you can even solve a problem like that. There's another feature that I want to plug because I really hope that people who are listening to this podcast know about it and realize that you could build this into your own applications. We also had something called Google Wave gadgets. We had gadgets and extensions, and it doesn't matter the distinction, but you could have a wave, and inside of it, the internal data structure was an XML tree with annotations. So you could do rich text, but also have arbitrary XML nodes. You could make different little applications, and the application would be embedded inside the page, and the application would be given some small subsection of the XML tree to be able to collaboratively edit. So as a result, we could build things, and anyone in the community could build things that you could drop into a wave. And when you dropped it into a wave, now you've got a small, drop-in application that you could collaboratively edit inside of. So for example, we built a Google Maps extension that let you plan your holiday with a friend and, with as many friends as you want. And you could all put down marker pins and draw little lines on the map. We had the yes, no, maybe gadget was the most famous, where someone would post in the office and say, hey, is anyone up for seeing the new movie, whatever it is, on Tuesday at 7 p.m. And in the wave would be a little like 3 columns, and you could click yes, no, or maybe. And whichever column you clicked on, your face would appear in that, alongside everyone else that clicked on yes, no, or maybe. Or you could have little polls. And while you had the page open, you could see everyone's faces appear all in real time, because that component, which isn't part of Wave itself, it was an extension, gets to be able to sit on top of the collaboratively editing infrastructure and work, which was so cool.
That is so amazing. And I'm like both super excited just hearing about that again, like amplified by hell. This was like in 2010. Like this was like so much earlier. There was no WASM, there was no TypeScript. There was like the web was like so early. And you didn't just innovate on those technologies, but you innovated so much on those. Like you really try to push to whole new frontiers what a product experience can be like. That real-time collaboration, like tied to a phase, etc. And I don't really think that we have that in a as modular as a way as you described it right now. Like typically you have those sort of super modular ways in a more standalone open, like niche open source thing, but not in a mainstream product that everyone is using. And I think the closest to actually who's going after the same vision that comes to mind are the folks at Ink and Switch who are building Patchwork. And I get to see the in progress updates there once in a while, and it's so cool. And like now I see the strong parallels there, and I think they have a similar vision there. They're just starting from a different foundation. They're building it as on top of AutoMerge. We're going to have Peter van Hardenberg back on the show to talk about Patchwork, as well as at the upcoming Local First conference. But there's many similarities there. So yeah, this is super inspiring.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I feel like that's sort of my dream software. I want to have, in particular for creative work, I think. Like if I'm going to be, I don't know, If I'm using IRC or some, Discord or something, fine. I understand that it makes the most sense to have some semi-centralized system, but for creative work, for if I'm writing a book, if I'm collaboratively editing a video with some other people, I want to be able to have something that both has some data living inside some open platform that any application and anyone who's interested can grab a copy of the data and listen to changes and make changes to the data model, just as a raw JSON model or something. And then also, like, that's sort of the holy grail of then being able to have custom extensions and custom bits of software that can be plugged in. It's not a static platform. It's something that people can, build cool UI on top of and try out different things. I've got this idea in my mind that I can't escape, which is, it was someone in the broader community once described Google Wave as the glorious data bus in the sky of, this amazing data bus that just moves all of our data around between computers. And you don't have to think about it. And it's complicated and it doesn't matter. You just know that you've got some data. And anytime you want it, it can be on your device and it can be up to date and it can be, you can make collaborative changes with anyone else. And if you had something like a JSON data model or something like the data model in YJS or AutoMerge, then you could have a data model that then you could have lots of different pieces of software interoperably interact with that same bit of data. So, if I've got a whole bunch of server logs in there and it's just in the cloud, not the cloud, centralized cloud, but in this data model, and I can subscribe to that and I can have an application that listens to those logs, produces a report and produces and updates that report in real time, and then puts that back in the set of data. And that's kind of a boring example. The one I often think about is compilers. So I've got a bunch of source code files and I could have all of that in this data model. So I've got a bunch of files and I want to just be able to open any program on my computer to be able to make changes. And not just on my computer, but on any of my devices. Grab my iPad, grab my, grab a Raspberry Pi and make changes. And then I want my compiler just to be able to listen to the stream of all of the changes and be live recompiling based on the differences in the source code and putting back into another data model a set of annotations describing where all the errors are and how the syntax highlighting should work and anything else the compiler wants. And then we can have different IDEs that don't have to understand the programming language at all because they can just listen to the compiler. And then, for example, I could have like a testing suite as well. And then the compiler is keeping up to date an executable, a binary file that's just made of a bunch of small blocks, which are all like functions that have compiled in, linked in. And then I could have a testing suite that every 30 seconds, so long as there's been changes, it reruns the testing suite and keeps up to date a set of like which tests are passing and failing. I like the Unix model is, like lots of small programs that can interoperate and talk to each other. But then we threw all that away. And I, to this day, I love using IntelliJ, right? Like Rust Rover, that's it. Yeah. Yeah. But these programs are these huge monolithic programs because the only way to get all of these small components of an IDE to talk to each other is by putting them inside one piece of software. The Unix model itself sort of fell apart because we don't have the right primitives to be able to plug programs into each other,
I think this is where I also see stark parallels again to what the folks at Ink and Switch are going after, where they're building this big data bus with AutoMerge and then build sort of like systems around it. And I think Patchwork is both a huge exploration what that could be, but also drives even more requirements for the ecosystem to form around it. It's sort of interesting how the data bus is one aspect, but then the other resurfacing idea is basically like a stateful build system where you basically like you listen to something and you do a computation and that result other things can listen to, so it becomes like this big tree that ideally incrementally recomputes. And this is how most reliable systems that we use on a daily basis work, but unfortunately they're concealed in a box and typically don't interoperate beyond a certain system. And I think this is another common theme that I'd like to see explored more. How can, like within Google, most things can talk to each other, but now everything is in that big Google box. But how can we go even beyond that? And this is where maybe coming back to the initial ideas behind Google Wave, where you wanted to build your own protocol. Can you share more about that protocol and the goals for it?
Yeah. In my mind, the way that I would solve this problem if I were to start today is to pick some data model. So for example, AutoMerge, and then create a protocol where multiple peers, that takes care of peer discovery, of authentication, all of that kind of stuff. So that way you can have some little package of software, some binary that you link to, or a JavaScript package, NPM library or something that will give you access to this data collection. And then you can make a program that can say, oh, I would like to subscribe to this kind of data, please. And you can see it. For Wave, like we started trying to solve this problem. And at the time, we used operational transform because there were no other options. Like it's 2011. I think the first CRDT paper might have come out around 2005. But performance-wise, it performed terribly. Like if you just typed a regular document of a few pages long, it would use almost a gigabyte of RAM in memory and a similar amount of disk space just to store the entire object tree that it created. It performed very badly.
And that being client side or server side?
Both, because they'd be running all the same code. So that was the problem with CRDTs. So we used an operational transform-based approach, which is based on the Jupyter OT algorithm. And at its heart, Jupyter, there's a few different ways to say this for people who aren't familiar with the technology. Jupyter uses, it's only correct if there are exactly like either one or two participants. So it can't work at all if there's more than two participants. So 3, there's a whole bunch of correctness problems. But you can solve that by having the server be one of the participants, essentially. So one way to think about it is that every user is collaboratively editing with their server, and the server then can collaboratively edit with every user individually. So you can have a real-time collaborative editing system, and OT-based systems, most of them work like this, so long as you have a centralized server which gets to make all of the decisions. And really what that server is needed for is to order things and create a canonical ordering of all of the events. So ultimately, OT systems like that, and there's a lot of different OT systems, end up with you mentioned event sourcing earlier, you end up with an event sourcing style list of operations that can all be applied in order. And if you start at an empty document, apply all the operations, you'll end up with the current document state. And you just have one, monotonically increasing version number, which is the version after, n operations have been applied. So that works great. It's pretty fast. It's what we use for Google Wave. But Google Wave ran into the problem where we wanted to be able to have federation. So we wanted to be able to have an arbitrary set of servers work. And for that, the network protocol was horribly complicated and it didn't work reliably. I saw it work reliably. It felt like, depended on the phases of the moon and everything else, where the servers needed to, between all of the servers, arrange themselves in a tree so that there was one server that was the most in charge of all of the servers. And unfortunately, if that server disappeared, then you'd have a net split. And all of this was it was a problem with the technology of the day. It was a problem with operational transform, ultimately, that we couldn't build what we wanted to build with OT. And that sort of got me thinking, like, how do we solve this problem? So this is condensing about 12, 13 years of my time. Just very briefly, after Google Wave shut down in 2011, I was incredibly sad about it. And I thought, there's no way, this technology is so cool. So JavaScript was, as a language that people like to write, was very new. It was Node.js 0.4. NPM hadn't been invented yet, if you can imagine it. And I thought, I'm going to use JavaScript and just write a really, really simple small library that does operational transform in JavaScript. And I called it ShareJS. And weirdly, lots of people know about the project, even though I've taken the website down and, it's not used for much now. I had a call with someone who works at WordPress the other day, and apparently ShareJS helped them land some giant deal with a company in Europe, which I'm not going to name, and was used as the backend for this whole news site for a long time, which I had no idea about because it just implemented operational transform well, which is all you want a lot of the time. So I made that. But I was still thinking about this question of how to make CRDTs fast. There was a whole series of new papers that happened again and again and again. And I felt like if we had a good version of operational transform, we could make an open source version of Wave or something like it, but it still didn't quite scratch the itch because I still didn't quite know how we could get all of these servers to collaboratively, collaborate. Eventually, a few years ago, I ended up getting frustrated and I thought, I've been avoiding CRDTs for the longest time. And I read some CRDT literature and I was like, no, what's the latest on CRDTs? How are they supposed to work? And I read some papers and I thought, this is ridiculous. You could make an implementation of this that works fast. The only reason why CRDTs were slow at the time is because people hadn't spent enough time optimizing the algorithms themselves. And Kevin Yarns, the author of YJS, he'd done a lot of work. Martin Kleppmann, the author of AutoMerge, had done a lot of work. But at the time, YJS performed okay. AutoMerge was incredibly slow. And to work around that, AutoMerge at the time separated all the code out into this front end and back end. So the back end did all the slow work. And then it had message passing to pass message into the back end so that this whole slow part of it wouldn't interrupt the user experience. But I grabbed a whole bunch of ideas from both approaches, and there's a YouTube video of me picking Kevin Yarns' brain on YouTube if anyone's ever interested watching for 3 hours us talk about CRDTs. But it turns out that, with the right application of some complex data structures, using B trees in the right ways and using some of the techniques that Martin Kleppmann, he was the first person I saw do it, where in the file system, the way that auto merge saves data to disk, most applications think about it and they call it an array of structs. So if I've got a bunch of rows in a table, every row is an object or a struct, and then I've got an array of them. I might have 100 of them, and each one represents a row. Most databases spin that on its head. So the database will instead store one file per column. So it's a struct of arrays, if you want to think about it that way. What Martin Kleppmann did is he said, well, each of these columns in something like auto merge, if it's describing all of the keystrokes that happened, we can store that as a string. And if it's describing the positions inside a document that everything is stored, well, those numbers turn out to be sequential almost all of the time. People usually type in runs of about 20 characters before they move their cursor. So if you just store run length encoded, that data ends up collapsing and becoming much smaller. So I was saying before, CRDTs, you type a moderate document, it might take 800 megabytes of memory or a gigabyte of memory and disk space to store it in raw JSON. But if you run length encode everything in these columns, you can store the same data in a megabyte or less. So Martin Kleppmann did that in the file storage engine of AutoMerge. YJS copied that. Then I took that idea and did that. Oh, and YJS also did some of this. I don't want to take credit for all of it. It's all standing on the shoulders of giants here. But I made a library called Diamond Types where I was like, oh, how fast could we make CRDTs go? And use that internally. So all of the internal data is all run length encoded internally. And that's a whole tangent that I need to write up at some point because there's a whole bunch of clever engineering tricks to make that work. But as a result, you can make CRDTs incredibly fast, way faster than anyone could possibly imagine. We're talking in the order of millions of keystrokes a second in a text editor, which is, more than anyone would want to type. And we can store it all very efficiently to the point that I added LZ4 compression. So in Diamond Types, I store all of the text content of what you've typed, and then a bunch of metadata that stores all of this extra CRDT stuff, essentially. It turns out that if you LZ4, just use a very standard, very, very fast, low-grade compression system on the text, then the amount of data that you save just by compressing the text lets you put all of that metadata in. And often you end up with documents that are smaller than the original text, even though you've got a keystroke by keystroke entire history stored in the same file, which is really cool. So a few more decades or I guess 1 decade of work after Google Wave. And we collectively as an industry have figured out how to solve the problem of CRDTs. I mean, I've had several people come and talk to me over the years and say, Seph, you could remake Google Wave. And I'm like, I know. And we could remake it better and greater. And maybe Patchwork is trying to aim towards some of that. But we're in a much better place from all of that work.
So let's come back to ShareJS in a moment. I want to learn more about those various components. But maybe jumping ahead for a bit, what would it take today to rebuild Google Wave with the technology stack of your dreams?
Honestly, the biggest thing would be some funding. So Google Wave used Operational Transform, and now we've got great CRDTs available. So I would use my own implementation of CRDTs or use AutoMerge or YJS. I think any of those libraries work great. And there's a bunch more that people working on that would probably perform fine. So we'd use the CRDT. Google Wave used it actually. People forget this. We created a custom Jabber, XMPP extension, and the servers interoperated through that, which is complicated. And I probably wouldn't make that same choice. We need an identity system. If I were to do it today, and yes, I have been thinking about this, I'd consider piggybacking on the Blue Sky identity system. And since that's actually a federated system, even though they haven't built all of the tooling to make it easy, but I think it's actually an excellent system and lets people, one of the freedoms that system guarantees is that if you've got an identity on one computer or one domain name, so identities are associated with a domain name, you can migrate that identity to another domain name. And anyone that knew your old identity will have their contact address books automatically update and all of your data moves across, which is great. So we need an identity system, maybe that, maybe something else. And then we need a web front end or a front end of some sort. And unfortunately, it's so embarrassing on behalf of our industry. One of the last bastions of unsolved problems is making a good rich text editor inside a web browser. In the last, however many years it's been, it's 2015. So I guess it's been 14 years since Google Wave shut down in 2011. In all of that time, there's been multiple aborted attempts to try and make a web standard for being able to edit a rich text document, and none of them have succeeded. All of them have fallen apart, and rich text editing is a massive mess. But there are a lot of JavaScript libraries that pave over a lot of the worst parts of that problem.
Maybe lingering on the last aspect for a bit, I have deliberately tried to avoid rich text editing and all facets of it just for my own sanity's sake. Me working primarily on Overtone and Live Store. Overtone is a music app where I can gloss over rich text editing for the moment. This is where it's rather important that your music library is in sync, playback history, playback state is in sync, etc. That's why I'm leaning on event sourcing. But looking at rich text editing and real-time collaboration on text, I'm aware of projects such as Prose Mirror or Code Mirror as sort of the code twin project to it. I'm aware of the TipTap rich text editing framework. I'm also aware that Facebook has, I think, a pretty good one, which I'm blanking on the name right now. But yeah, where are those projects falling short? I mean, ideally, I'm with you. This would be a web primitive that is like standardized and implemented by all browsers. But what's so hard getting there, and where do the existing solutions fall short?
Honestly, they're probably mostly fine. They fall short in, for example, mobile editing. So I want to be able to have a native experience on my phone. If I open up Apple Notes, I can select text and I can bold it and highlight it and do lots of different things. A lot of the existing editors will, it's just really hard to hook into the native rich text editing through a web browser through mobile Safari. So they need that to work. And then they need it to work from Chrome with Android. And then they need it to work with lots of different things. I mean, I still run into problems sometimes on Reddit. If you use the new Reddit interface, they've got a rich text editor in the reply box. And sometimes I've typed and then hit hit undo, and weird things reappear or disappear, or the wrong text, it gets garbled and confused. So there's a bunch of correctness problems like that. It's incredibly boring work, but it's really important for this kind of thing. I have a long-standing rule. I don't know if this has a name, so maybe it can be Seph's rule if no one else has claimed it, but that essentially technology gets worse the further away from mostly Bay Area software engineer problems that you are. So if you have the kind of problem that a Bay Area technologist thinks about a lot, there's going to be good libraries, good software, good tooling around solving that problem. But if you, for example, speak a language where characters are typed right to left instead, you're going to run into problems. In Australia, we have roundabouts, which the Americans call traffic circles. And Google Maps took a decade to be able to understand how to actually give you navigation directions around a roundabout in Australia, because they don't have them in America. They have a few, but most Americans I know are terrified of them. But I feel like rich text editing is one of these problems because us software engineers mostly use plain text. So there are so many great plain text editors that exist both on the web and on desktop. But yeah, rich text is just harder. It's further away from the problems that we regularly solve.
I fully agree. And I love Seph's rule. Maybe that it's going to become a thing. And so in particular to you touching on mobile, I feel like mobile and the combination of mobile and web, that is indeed like one of the hardest modes that are still largely untamed. And this is both, I think, particularly for web technologies, but overall, it had less time to kind of mature over time. And particularly for web mobile experiences, when it comes to text editing, etc., like dragging around a cursor, this is where things feel very choppy. The creator of React, Jordan Walk, he shares some things about that once in a while, where he's kind of particularly pointing out where mobile web is falling short to be competitive with mobile native in terms of animations and like just native interactions. I mean, it's a very hard set of problems, but I think addressing those feels very worthwhile to make the web even a richer platform. But then you could also argue that's sort of not necessarily in the interest of Apple, and that's a whole different kind of worms.
I mean, yeah, it's easiest to think of Apple as a person, but they're actually, I can't remember what the number is, like 200,000 people or something. And some of those people are really interested in open standards and some aren't. And some of them are great people and some of them are assholes. And that's true of every company that you could name,
I agree. And in Apple's credits, they have pushed Safari and the capabilities way forward over the last couple of years. It really has come a long way.
Yeah, I think the Safari team is very dedicated to making Safari an excellent web browser, and it shows. But there's still some hard problems that haven't been tackled yet. It's quite sad. When I was young, I started programming when I was about 10 years old. And every year there would be new things and new technology. And, like I got to see the birth of Windows 95. And I thought, wow, programming is going to be so easy in the future. I imagine that at the time there was whole teams of people working on making something, but in the future there'd be such good libraries and such good software tools available that one person could do the work of an entire team or entire of a whole project, because you could just grab in such good software and there'd be such good primitives available to be able to solve all the problems that you had. And I feel like that prediction of young me, I'm so sad. I'm really disappointed that it didn't come to pass. And instead we have, it's like, oh, back then, if you wanted to build a program, you want to write some software. Well, I mean, like, I'm so sorry to everybody else, but I would have just targeted Windows. I'd written a Windows application and there it is. And, made some little command line tool in DOS, or, if you're working in Linux, you would just make a command line tool because that was how most good software existed. But now it's like, oh, well, I guess you're going to want a Linux and Windows and Mac OS desktop version of your application. And then you need to make it work for iOS and Android as well. So there's 5 different platforms right out of the gate. And, are you even trying if it doesn't work on all 5 of those platforms? And it should work well. But I guess you could just use the web. But the web's not actually very good on mobile platforms. So you really want to have a native application. Oh, but all the programming languages that you use for building native applications on iOS are different from Android, different from the web, different from everything else. And and we keep on saying, well, we can kind of solve this with WebAssembly, for example, and that way we can have one target from all of these different bits of software. And that's true if we had good UX libraries across every platform, which were consistent and work well. I mean, this is somewhere I was very excited about React Native when it first came out, and so many people were kind of like, some random thing. I was like, please, I really want just one good, application programming interface I can use to build real software for real users. It feels like a tragedy of the commons problem in my mind, that there's so many companies doing really good work, but each company, of course, is trying to solve the problem that their particular company will make money from. And there are the commons in software, the commons of the standard set of desktop application, of user interface libraries. Say, if I wanted to write a desktop application in Rust, there's open source libraries which will interact from Rust to GTK and Rust to the Windows libraries and so on. But almost all of them are maintained by volunteers. And it's a huge problem. Like, Google Chrome has probably had $1 billion of investment put into it at this point, to be able to have a web browser that works across every platform and let you be able to run arbitrary software, like arbitrary web software, across all the platforms Google Chrome runs. And it might take something around that order of magnitude to have a really good user interface library that works across every platform that exists today, so that I can just build, like, write once, run everywhere, like write software once, write patchwork, write something like that, and then just have good primitives that mean that my program can work in every context that I want it to run. But as far as I can tell, no one's really putting that time and effort and investment in. Like, there's things like Flutter, and I'm very excited by them, but I'm burned by Google projects being canceled before. But it just feels like one of these things that, like, I want that. And then on the flip side of that, we've got things like SQL, which I have massive problems with, even though it's one of the best. Like, think programs like Postgres are some of the highest quality software that exists today that we use regularly. And yet its design is from the 70s. There's a wonderful talk by Rich Hickey where he talks about value-oriented programming and place-oriented programming. And he says that back in the day, we didn't have much memory. Our computers had literally, like, some of the old Ataris. The Nintendo Entertainment System has less RAM than is available in one tweet, before they made tweets longer. It had it's like 120 bytes of RAM or something ridiculous. And they made Super Mario Brothers with these wild limitations. And so it makes sense, if you're storing data, that every time the value changes, you have one place where the value goes, and you replace the value that's stored there. And now SQL is stuck in the past, where we've got a table and you just edit the rows and you've got no idea of what's actually changed. And that makes it incredibly difficult to build collaborative software, because you need to know that kind of history. So people maybe layer collaborative things on top of Postgres, but then now Postgres, you're sort of fighting against the ergonomics of Postgres itself. And again, no one's solving this problem, and it really upsets me.
Oh man, I have so many thoughts on this. I 100% agree with, like, that assessment of, like, the tragedy of the commons, and I'm both devastated about it and also hopeful because of some of the initiatives that you've mentioned. The TLDR of it is that I still think that the web is the best vehicle for us to make it through this uncanny valley. Since I think if you exclude some aspects, for example, mobile web or some other, or strict browser compatibility to a certain limit, Firefox is lagging behind in a bunch of things. You can actually already live in the future by building fully for the web. Things like WebAssembly have come a long way. Things like WebGPU, etc. And there's also new frameworks that are in the making, but not as mainstream yet, that fully embrace those. So where some lower level primitives could be taking advantage of WebAssembly or WebGPU, the thing that commonly strikes me is like the most comical unsolved problems is list rendering, where we have so many React list virtualization libraries, and most of them still suffer from the same underlying problems. And whenever you render a list, there's like some symptoms that appear. Typically comes along with frame drops, but also like it's rare that you persist the position of a list. And there's just like, if you start digging into lists as unsolved problems, it becomes very comical. The way how I try to address that for myself is by rendering to a canvas. and just,
Oh
and
no,
that's
no, don't do
a
that.
whole different approach altogether. We don't need to
Please
go
no.
into that rabbit hole. But yeah, I'm hopeful that things are coming along. And you've also been mentioning React Native. That's a long project. And in a way, I have so much admiration and respect for the people who relentlessly keep pushing forward on that. There's been some really big breakthroughs over the last couple of years. Some of them you would think like, wait, that's kind of obvious. Why wasn't it like that from the beginning? But there are reasons for that. But it's really getting there, and particularly for mobile, it is like it's becoming a really attractive platform to ship things. And this is where you can, at least when your goal is at least code reuse, then you can get a long way if you target React and React Native. We're not yet at that point where you have the same set of like interactive components and they work on all platforms no matter what. Maybe at some point, but there is progress in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, while we're at it, I'm just going to throw out some more things that I hope other people fix. Oh, someone fixes. Like, it might end up being me. I was saying earlier that if I could live 1,000 lives, I would just spend a lot of them rewriting bit by bit every piece of software that runs on my computer, so everything actually works well and consistently. I've been building a little helper tool web app just for the last couple of days to be able to annotate documents, to be able to. It doesn't really matter. It's some little helper web app. And once again, I'm frustrated because I have a server and my server has some data, and I've got a front end and my front end needs to edit that data. And as I change the data, the changes need to be propagated to the server, and the server keeps a copy of it, which it stores on disk. And that problem, I feel like every single time I try and approach it, I have to re-implement the wheel and I start from scratch. And it's not even, this data that I'm editing isn't even collaborative. It's just like, okay, great. Let's start climbing the ladder of editing once again. So the first step, I've got one object and I send it to the browser, and the browser sends back an entire copy of it. Next rung, okay, the server can do versioning where the browser can subscribe, it can get a certain version, find out what version it is. Next run, now I can subscribe. So the browser can subscribe from some version. Every time a new version gets sent, the server sends a new copy of the data. Okay, then now I can do differential updates. Now I can do collaboratively editing on top of the differential updates. Okay, now I can do anyway, it's just a series of things over and over and over again for every single piece of software I end up writing. And most of the time I'll cap out somewhere pretty low down that ladder, even though I'm probably one of the, I know all of the tools. I know all of the ways that we can make this problem be good, but our platform isn't very good. And I think a lot of the problem with that is because we still think in most software about messaging. It's a message-oriented system. But how we actually want to think for a lot of this isn't about messages, it's about updates. It's I've got some semantic idea of the state of the world, and instead of sending messages to the client, which is kind of a low-level primitive, I instead want to be sending updates and describing how the document is changed over time. I was working with the Braid group trying to build, so we together wrote a proposal for the IETF on a primitive that we could add that's different from get and put and post and so on, but a different verb, which would be a subscribe verb, to say, if there's some resource that lives at some URL, I want that resource to be able to change over time. And I don't want to have to reinvent the wheel every single time, describing how that resource changes. In fact, it would be great if the web, like HTTP itself, had a primitive that described a resource that could change over time. And then, for example, Nginx, if Nginx understood that that was something that changed over time, instead of Nginx storing some cache invalidation time and then occasionally revalidating its cache, but in the meantime, it's serving out stale copies of this resource. Instead, Nginx could just subscribe to the underlying layer and say, hey, I'm interested in this document, and tell me every time it changes. And then Nginx can be doing fan out to all of the different clients that are interested in subscribing to that document. And you'd have a much better, much more performant way of being able to distribute data around that is way easier to program, way faster from a performance perspective. And then it could be integrated into lots of things, like integrated into Postgres, integrated as a standard thing that we have access to in our web servers, something we have access to in our web browsers, and so on. And it's primitives like this in my mind that, like, I'm like, oh, please, please give me better things like this. This is the kind of thing that I feel like all computing, again, it's a lesson from Google Wave. All computing can work like this. You can just have the data update in real time. And this is a primitive that almost every program I've ever worked on is needed in some form of, in a web browser, in a mobile phone, in some monitoring application. I have some data that lives somewhere and I want my application to be kept up to date and told whenever changes happen. And then I want to be able to edit that data from different clients and have something sensible happen. And there's a simple version of that, which is the centralized version, where a centralized server has to authorize all changes, and you have a version number that goes up by 1 every time a change happens, which we should be able to just trivially have built into Postgres in my mind and SQL databases. And then there's the CRDT, the real-time collaborative editing use case for that, where I don't actually want a single version number. I want something kind of like Git, but where I can collaboratively edit any kind of data and I can do it in real time rather than needing to hit commit every time I make a change. I want to push that out. And hopefully as well, I want to be able to do optimistic replication, optimistic concurrency control. So the Ink and Switch team is working on this and having branches and so on for other kinds of applications, right? Again, it's my rule. It's like we've built these tools for ourselves for code editing where we get to collaborate using Git. We get to have branches. We get to do merging. We get to look at all the diffs between versions. Everybody wants these tools. Everyone, from people working on CRMs to people doing video editing to people, I'm sure wanting to talk to astronauts in space. This comes up all the time. And for those kind of people, for these projects that want to build using these kind of primitives, it's so hard to have, our primitives on modern software aren't there. And no one, application teams aren't working on it because they've got products to ship.
So I've had a couple of folks who are working on that on the podcast before. So for example, notably the folks working at Electric, they're tackling specifically that problem for Postgres, where exactly as you're describing, that you can subscribe to, or you can basically just express something they call a shape. It's sort of like, we can oversimplify, it's like sort of a scoped query, and then your client can subscribe to the result of those queries, and it basically always gets an up-to-date query result locally, well, eventually consistent, but you already get those sort of one level up primitive where you don't need to think about get, put, pose, delete, but you can just subscribe to that. Well, it comes with its own challenges. And if you're looking at the fundamental layer that you describe as message oriented, I think that's closer to the metal and where you need to roll up your sleeves more. But it also allows you to implement things for different trade-offs in mind. So one thing I'm curious about, how you're navigating trade-offs. When it comes to data, it's all about trade-offs, like what for a given application, what can you get away with? How much is fine that different parts of the application state, do they need to be fully transactional, or is it fine that one part of the application is maybe lagging slightly behind? And how do you address the cap theorem for your particular application? So I'm curious how you're thinking about navigating trade-offs, and trade-offs even go to a point not just to build the initial app, but also to keep in mind how you need to evolve the app over time. How certain are you about the data model that you've picked, that this is the one you still have in 5 years? You're going to have it in 5 years probably no matter what. But the question is, are you still happy with it in 5 years? Or is this the worst decision you've made building the application? So I'm curious how you're thinking about navigating trade-offs when you design an application, the data layer for an application.
I mean, fundamentally, as engineers, you navigate them one by one, while sweating profusely. That's how that goes, I think. Yeah, I feel like there's a bunch of interesting problems in all of the things that you've said. I had a couple of small conversations with PVH talking about, he built this thing based around lenses of how data can evolve over time in a Cambria. That was it. Yeah. In local first software. And I have a bunch of my own thoughts about that. And, I've got designs in mind that I'd love to experiment and play with. So there's something there, which is, it's really interesting. HTML has evolved beautifully over time. HTML has barely changed at all since it was first introduced. We've introduced new tags, but almost all of the tags still follow the same fundamentally XML style structure. And that's wonderful. It's wonderful that's been able to evolve like that. Email has evolved slightly less gracefully, but I think email programs from the 70s probably still work today with most modern emails, which is incredible. Even though email messages themselves are almost impossible to parse correctly. And I've got a lot of thoughts about that as well. I've got some friends who work at Fastmail, and they've pinned me to the wall with things about email that I had no idea about that are horrific. But there's this open problem, which is how can data models change? So there's a set of problems there, which I'd love to solve. There's a set of problems around how is our data stored and sent. In my mind, what I would really like to have is, I feel like there's some kinds of programs where I actually really, I'm so sorry to the Ink and Switch folks. I'm quite happy for there to be a centralized server for Discord or for IRC, for something like that, when there's a place that we all go to. I'm quite happy for there to be one computer that's authoritative and decides, all of the messages that are and aren't part of the log of messages. I feel the same way about banks. I'm more than happy for them to use a centralized transactional database. I'm not a Bitcoin absolutist by any means. I think that centralized databases work great. But I'd really like some set of primitives where the primitives that I use in my computer program, like what I embed into my program and use, are the same set of primitives that I could use either with a centralized server, which has transactions and various other ergonomics, or with something like AutoMerge or YJS, where I'm actually collaboratively editing CRDT. I feel like there's a lot of overlap there around what's the shape of the data, what does the change look like, subscriptions, which also you almost always want in a centralized use case. And then there's a bunch of questions around performance. So I wrote a CRDT library of my own called Diamond Types. I haven't kept up with all of the demands that I have made of myself. Got busy and distracted, but I used that. That was the testbed and original place where I built Eggwalker, which is an algorithm that I've written a paper on, just for collaborative text editing. And I wanted to make it really, really fast. And people kept saying, well, but don't you know that if you collaboratively edit a text document in something like YJS or AutoMerge, it stores every single keystroke that's ever made to the document. And these documents are going to get huge, and we need some way to be able to prune history, and it's really important. So I said, well, look, I agree. I think that's a very interesting and important problem. But let's just start by trying to make it as fast as possible and as small as possible. So, even if we prune it, it's going to be pruned to be even smaller regardless. This is always when I do a lot of performance work, and a lot of times people reach for multi-threading. Let's spawn it across lots of threads on your computer, which is a fine approach, but it's almost always better to start with trying to make it run as fast as you can on one thread before you run it across multiple threads.
This is why the M1 series of Apple was like such a big deal, because it showed like, okay, we can actually do a lot better even in a single threaded environment.
Exactly. Yeah. But it turns out that the collaboratively editable text documents don't actually grow very fast. The amount of data, the number of bytes on disk is tiny. And yeah, like I think that it might be useful to build software to prune anyway. And I've got a bunch of, I've thought a lot about that problem because people keep talking about it. But from an engineering perspective, a lot of the time we can just keep all of the data and it's actually fine. We just need to, for example, store it in some slightly more efficient way sometimes than raw JSON. And, and like that's the thing that we need to think about. Modern computers are so fast. Like, you don't talk.
I feel like similar to what you've mentioned before with quoting Paul Graham of like, what was the quote again?
It's what would it be ridiculous to not have 100 years?
Yeah, exactly. So
if you imagine 100 years, it's like we still don't have something. It's crazy. Then it's okay. Well, if we didn't have that in 100 years, it would be crazy. Could we just build it today?
Exactly. Yeah. So similar to that, we can also ask ourselves more often, like, which things would actually be totally fine that historically we always like shied away from. And that's sort of like by now there's sort of like this picture of like a baby elephant kind of pinned to a pole, and it has learned it cannot escape. And now it's a full up grown elephant. It's still pinned to this tiny pole. I think there's like a lot of similar stuff, the way how we go about programming, and we need to unlearn, forget about some things. And this is, I feel like, also why some of the most brilliant new technologies are by people, by newcomers, like new generations of programmers who are like blissfully unaware of some of like the old stigma. And this is how we get new ideas as well.
Yeah, I really agree with that. There's something that it doesn't, I keep thinking about. There was the Unix room. So Unix was invented in a place by some people. And they sat in a room together and they had one computer and they would write programs and show them to each other. And someone wrote spell, and someone wrote, like, they wrote these different little Unix programs and said, hey, check it out. And then some people made the pipe operator and made piping work. And they started to be able to connect these programs together to be able to make, quite complex programs just as a series of small programs piped together. This is a really beautiful primitive, and it's a beautiful thing that someone created, and we have it on all of our modern terminals. I think there's even a version on Windows, but all Unixes have something like this. I feel like at some point we gave up trying to invent new kinds of primitives like that, and I don't know why, but it feels like the sort of thing that we should be able to do. Obviously, I sometimes think about we've been talking about the web a bit, and we have this beautiful idea, which is, so we've got these two different ideas right now. We've got a desktop application, and desktop applications have access to everything that the user has access to by default, which is interesting. And Apple's trying to change this, but keeps getting in trouble for it. Desktop applications are binaries. They're always native binaries on every platform, and they have access to some set of native APIs, and they can make syscalls directly. And then we have another set of applications called web applications, which are sandboxed by a browser and, historically only written in JavaScript and written in a way that they can operate on every computer, but only inside the web browser. And like, web applications are really successful, I think, not because of the web browser, but because you don't have to install them. And people sort of forget this, but they're kind of equivalent, except this one you have to install for some reason, and this one you don't. And because you don't have to install a web app, people spend a lot of time optimizing them for size. So you load up the New York Times, and it'll load a lot of crap, probably, but we're looking on the order of maybe half a meg of JavaScript. Maybe it's a couple megs of JavaScript and some images. Whereas if I install, I haven't actually tried this. I'm going to get in trouble by somebody who'll actually go and look. But you look at most iPhone apps, for example, and they're hundreds of megabytes in size. I think the Uber app is like 300 megs or something crazy. Like the Facebook app is huge. And it doesn't even have content. Like, it's not even like the Uber app is loading, it's like installing databases. Who even knows what's in there? But then web applications are written in slow languages. And I just feel like it's like, well, we could just make a new platform and we could give it a new kind of application where you don't have to install it, but also it gets access to some set of beautiful native primitives that might be even better than what web provides today for applications themselves. Like, the web obviously is designed as a document viewing platform, and then we've sort of hacked on applications because it was so convenient. And we could make it so that data is just transparently available and accessible between programs beautifully using all of the tools and technologies we've been talking about. But no one works on this stuff because we sort of take for granted. It's like there's the ruins of old Rome, and that's like Unix, or it's the machine code and x86 assembly. And then modern, people say, oh, well, then they build the web browser, and then we build on top of the web browser React, and then you build an application on top of React, but then the application's slow, so you do some other wacky thing on top of that. And it's like, underneath the city is this giant, all of these ruins that are all full of code and all being used by modern programs. But so many people, particularly young engineers, they have no idea about all of this crap. They just know that if they type the right thing into a React application, that they'll get something on the screen. But all of that stuff, we can actually burn it all if we want to, and then go and make beautiful things right from the very base of computers.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is sort of like innovator's dilemma. And I think you're mentioning email as an example. I think this is one of the worst, since you just emails and browsers, like you just cannot get away with like not supporting the old stuff. And this is where, if you build a brand new thing, you don't have to account for all of like the historic mess, and you can just start over. And I think this is probably just having the courage or naivety to start over. I think that's highly underrated. And also, for the record, I've just checked blank loading New York Times. It's like currently 5 megabytes of just JavaScript, and depending on, and 20 megs of like other stuff that I've loaded, like with images and so on. So I think that this just proves the point. Like, even for New York Times, like 5 megs of JavaScript, it's fine. I don't want to know how much of that is like ads related, etc. But I just want to encourage people to rethink their learned thinking about trade-offs. Like, it's at the same time we're kind of indoctrinated with like, okay, we need to make the initial page load as quick as possible. We always have connectivity. I'd like to alter that slightly and say, like, when we're connected, we probably have pretty good connectivity. So let's embrace that, but we're not going to be always connected. For the moments where we don't have perfect connectivity, let's like piggyback on the times when we had good connectivity, and we should just sync the deltas instead of like reloading everything every time. Also goes back to the build problem, the build system problem that we had before. Since we don't build things in a principled enough way, so we don't trust the stuff that was there before. And so that leads to us reloading everything from scratch all the time. And I think that's another big culprit of systems problems.
I read a great article a while ago comparing the size of JavaScript bundles with War and Peace, saying like, could you, how many copies of War and Peace could fit in your JavaScript bundle? And it's quite a lot. And the other thing I sometimes think about is how many bytes of data would it take if you took a screenshot of your website, even as a PNG, and then sent me the screenshot? Would that be larger or smaller than it takes to load your website? And if the answer is that your screenshot would be smaller than all of the code that you send me, then maybe you're doing something wrong. But even then, like, yeah, I really encourage people to also think about from the perspective of the web browser. It's all code. If you start digging, it's code a really long way down, and all of that code can be changed. Like, web browsers are open source. I've got some, quite infamously, I've got some source code in Google Chrome to be able to interact with Xbox game controllers. I'm not sure if it's still there, but I wrote a userland USB driver for Google Chrome so that if you're on macOS in particular, so if you plug an Xbox game controller into a Mac computer and you want to play video games in browsers, then the Xbox controller will work. But there's so much stuff like that, and I think it's almost crazy that is in Google Chrome. It should be in the operating system. But there's lots of primitives that we could put in Google Chrome that would mean that, if there are things that we want to be able to have access to as web developers, we can build them in as primitives and everyone can get access to them. Like, a lot of the standards committees, you can just go to them, it turns out. Like, there's open mailing lists of the people that build all of this stuff. And they're just nerds like us, like, they've just got all of their own crotchety, angry opinions that they'll tell you about if you give them half a chance. But I don't know. I feel like there's not enough conversation around all this stuff, or how it could be better.
Going back slightly to the moment where you reflected on kind of the creation of primitives, what I found, at least looking back at my own creative work, what I found easier than just forcing a primitive into existing out of thin air is rather embrace sort of like the organic chaos and then study it really hard and then see basically out of the existing mess. Typically, if you look hard enough, if you observe hard enough, you can observe some things that later can emerge as primitives. And this is where, almost paradoxically, the more requirements I apply on a certain system, the more it becomes like simpler over time. And so I've basically just taken more kind of like inner peace by like not knowing the primitives up front right away. I'm basically just trying to solve the problem. Like, I happily say yes to a few problems, and I've had enough past experience where out of that mess, through lucky coincidences, I realize, okay, here's some useful, more general primitives. And in hindsight, those primitives look very obvious. And someone who then looks at that system and maybe builds a similar one, they can already embrace those primitive ideas and build on top of them in the beginning. But I think for novel new primitives, I think the most likely path for them to come into existence is out of emergence, and not out of like forcing them into existence out of thin air.
I agree with everything, and I'm a little bit dubious on that last point. And just to push back a little bit, I think that it's got to be this push and pull, like they're both so important. I really like what you said, though. Again, Rich Hickey, who you should watch all of his talks, anyone who's listening to this. He's much more insightful than I will ever be, I think. But he gave a talk once, and he talked about hammock-driven development, as in software development driven by writing some code and then going outside and lying in a hammock and thinking really hard about it. And just letting it percolate, like letting the design that you've come up with percolate and say, how does this problem actually really want to be solved if I were to do a good job at it? And instead of sort of half-assing a million things and having everyone across the industry half-ass the same set of 8 things, lists and so on, I don't know. I can't help but think that if a few people spend some serious time thinking a lot about lists, we could have some really nice lists in web browsers and all these different things. And then it would just be solved for everybody,
Maybe this is why I've prefaced it with like that's being, for me, the easier path. Like, for me, step one is half-arsing something and then looking at it, but I need to have it be laid out wrong first for me to spot, oh, this is how right looks like. Some more brilliant people than me can probably skip step one. But for me, this one has been a more proven approach.
I mean, it's the same for me. I used to teach programming, and something, my students would sort of sometimes come to me asking me how they should design their program before they'd even start writing any code. And I'm convinced that you know the least about your program. Like, you know the least about the program before you start writing it. That's the time that you will know the least that you will ever know about this problem. So you're the least qualified you're ever going to be to design it correctly. So you become qualified by throwing something on the screen and then taking the time to reflect on the knowledge that you've gained to figure out how it could be written in a better way. Yeah, I absolutely agree.
And I think this is also, this underscores like one of the most important things that I hold dearly in the craft of software engineering, which is the ease of iteration and the speed of iteration. And this is where I spend a obscene amount of time on just like making so that I have fun in iterating, that it's very cheap for me to get it wrong 10 times, and it's fun to do every iteration. But if it's gruesome to do one iteration, then you just run out of like joy and energy until you get to the right point. So making the iteration cycles, it's like, it sounds very obvious, but I think very few people actually put in the work, since it's also partially some pretty annoying work, like getting your mono repo set up, all dialed in, like like which JavaScript package manager should you use, like all of like those stupid things. But getting all of that stuff dialed in, I think that the reward is quite big.
I mean, I assume that you've read this, but again, to plug more things that people should read if they haven't, there's that beautiful essay of Worse is Better that talks about all of this. And I feel like, yeah, I think that life exists like in the intersection of thinking it through and just throwing something at the wall. And I think all good software is going to have elements of both of these things where, there's not too much upfront design and upfront thinking, but there's not too little of it either. Like there's got to be some amount of time. But after you've written a whole lot of code, you take a step back and you say, how should this have been? If I knew everything I knew now, how would I build it? And I think everything beautiful and everything incredible has a lot of those feedback loops. Like I listened to an amazing talk at GDC, the Game Developers Conference, once talking about this. And he said, essentially, all good games are made by having some ideas, writing them in code, trying them out, and then throwing out 80% of them because they weren't very good ideas. But 20% of them were really good ideas. And he said in that talk that the quality of any program that you make is proportional to the number of iteration cycles you get through. Not how long one cycle is, the number of iteration cycles, just the sheer amount of repetition that you go through in writing code, reflecting, changing the code, making it better, writing more code, and so on. And I think it's a beautiful idea. I've been doing improv comedy classes lately, and like over the last few years. And in improv, we learn you can't plan. There's no planning. You don't have a meeting with the people you share the stage with before the show starts. So everything is just asking the question of what comes next, which I feel like is this life philosophy. Just at every moment, what comes next? And maybe what comes next is writing more code, and maybe what comes next is stepping away and thinking about the code and refactoring it. But I feel like that's the right question just to hold, consciously.
So you've given me two segues now to ask you about another topic that I think is very top of mind for you. So one is sort of this almost evolution-like nature evolution of software and good products, etc., where it's all about the iteration cycles. That's like how biology works. This is why we as humans exist, etc., and why other good things exist. And then also asking the question, what is next? That's the essence of how an LM works. So I think you've been thinking a lot about the topic of AI and what that means for our culture of programmers and software creatives. So I'm curious, what are some of the leading questions for you are when you're thinking and like digging into the topic of AI?
I've told the story of me working on Google Wave, and I started there in about 2010. But I've been thinking about AI a lot since about 2002, I think, around when I started uni. I've got somewhere a pile of notebooks full of handwritten notes, thinking through lots of different ideas and ways to build AI systems. And I started a PhD, and I ended up leaving, and I felt disappointed, and I attacked myself because I couldn't get the things that I wanted to get working. And instead of just chipping away at it like I wish I had done in retrospect, I felt a whole lot of shame and guilt, and then walked away from the whole industry and haven't really come back, or it's been a while. I haven't come back in a big way for, 20, 23 years or something now, which is crazy. More than half of my life, running away from this dream that I had. But way back when, it's really interesting. We're in this transition period at the moment where AI is a similar intelligence to humans. But something I think about a lot with this kind of software is Like I mentioned before, that when I was young, thought that one human should be able to, as our tools let us become more productive, one person should be able to do the work of a whole team from a decade ago. And increasingly with AI, I think that's actually going to become the case. And I don't really know how it's going to change a lot of things, but I can imagine as we go forward that if we had better primitives and had primitives that the AIs understood, that a lot of these kind of problems that actually just require a whole lot of code, for example, like building a really good UX, like a UI toolkit that would be cross-platform, it's possible that we could start to build AI systems that could actually design good primitive tools for computer systems. And I don't know what that means for us. Like, I don't have any recommendations or advice or anything else, but it's really interesting to start thinking about it as, if your productivity isn't limited by what you can personally code anymore, which is, I think, going to increasingly be the case, then what do you want to build? And how can we start building, like utilizing AI tools that will increasingly, and obviously they're not quite yet there yet, build large swaths of working in usable software? I feel like this is just really open question of what does it even mean to be a software developer, but also what could we do again, right? Like that we can't do today because it would take the resources of Google to be able to build something that we might be able to do. Like if you wanted to build your own operating system and your own browser from scratch, you could just ask an AI to do it. How do we do that?
Have you been able to derive sort of like a set of invariants almost that are still going to be true in the age where AI will be a meaningful part of how software is created, etc.? Like, which aspects do you think are still meaningful for humans to play a meaningful role there?
I mean, it's a great question. I feel like there's this massive economic, loom thing that looms over all of us of, if you can't use your mind to do things that an AI couldn't do, then why would you ever be hired? Why would any human be hired for any job? And there's a threshold that we need to pass. Obviously with computers and AI systems, we can become more productive than we ever are today and produce more abundance and more resources and more useful programs and everything else. But if none of the humans are employed to do any of that, then we've got a huge economic problem. But the beautiful world on the other side of that, if we can possibly reach it, I think has to look like humans actually building the software and being able to be creative in all of the ways that we're born to be. I think that there's some element that's honestly our birthright in creative beings being able to make stuff. It feels so core to who we are. And the more that I get in touch with myself, the more I just want to build and play piano and write stories and do this kind of stuff.
Right,
So
like play as sort of like the most natural state of who we are.
yeah, I did. Again, this is a segue that I'll try not to drag us too far down. I went to France a year and a half ago and attended a clowning intensive, so physical comedy and performance for a month, and it was horrific. It was quite abusive in its own way. The guy who was teaching it has been teaching clowning for 40 years, and anyway, it was an incredible experience. But he said, he's this like grizzled old Frenchman, and he said that he thinks, and he's trained Sacha Baron Cohen and all these different people, but he thinks that the most beautiful thing that exists in the world is watching a child play. And, so much of clowning and physical comedy, and I think creativity in general, is rediscovering as adults, if we need to, that spark that's inside all of us and that just wants to build things and wants to play and wants to try stuff out and so on. And I don't know, that's my hope for AI, at least, is that if you were to play, if you wanted to make your own sandbox, grow a garden of software, whatever metaphor you want to think about it as, then what do you want to make? What are you called on to make? I live in an apartment building that overlooks a lot of the city, and there's this idea of dharma that's talked about in some Eastern philosophy, which is like, what is the duty that's your sacred duty that's yours alone to reach? And that duty, by the way, might just be to like be a really great parent. It doesn't have to be anything grand or grandiose in any way, but asking that question of what is it yours to do in the world that's yours uniquely, that no one else will do if you don't do it. I think that's really the question that we want to be asking ourselves as creative workers. And from that perspective, I'm excited about AI because I'm really hoping that it lets us answer questions like that more. And, like, I don't think economically we need local first software. Like we can trudge along with the feudalism of Google cloud services for, probably for a very long time. But I don't want that. I want beautiful software and programs that work in harmony with who I am as a person and in harmony with what kind of communities I want to be able to foster. And from that perspective, I think that's like why I care about local first software and why I hope that more people care about it, because I just think that we deserve, I don't know, we can just have nice things, like the cloud always feels like feudal city states, So back before we had democracy and before we had countries, you have these towns, and the town, it's not a democracy. There's one ruler, the noble, the local noble. And if you upset the noble, there's no laws necessarily. That's a recent invention. That the noble would say, no, not you. And you'd either be exiled if you're lucky, or hung from the town square if you did something the noble didn't like. And no one owns property. Only the noble owns the whole town. That's the rule, right? And so if you have a house, you have a house because the noble has graciously allowed you to live there. And that's the rule, And if the noble wants to do whatever they want to do, there's no higher law than the noble. And that feels like the software ecosystem that we exist in today, where, there's the Google city. And as much as I have endless respect for so many individuals that I know who I've worked with at Google, I think they're amazing people. But the experience is Google is a feudal city state where you walk into the gates, and if the local lord doesn't like you, then you can get banished at any moment out of Google. There's no recourse, there's no laws, there's no rules. It's not a democracy. You don't have any privacy. Everything you do is monitored 24/7 by the Google cameras that exist everywhere, in their nice little plastic, beautiful designed whatever. And if you don't like it, you can go down the street to the Apple town where everything is run by Apple. And Apple has slightly different values from Google. And I happen to like Apple's philosophy on privacy more than Google's, but it's the same kind of world. And I personally believe in democracy, and I like that my streets aren't owned by a company. Call me crazy. But yeah, and I don't know how it interacts with AI, but I feel like I don't know, it's like we've got this opportunity to be more creative, to make more stuff, to not need billions of dollars of funding. And it's up to us what we want to do with that.
And maybe it's a stretch, and maybe I'm putting words in your mouth here, but at least you've used the word democracy. And maybe that is also like something that people see in local first, that is almost a more democratic approach to software.
Yeah, I really agree. It's like I care about local first software the most for creative work. For like, if I'm composing a song, it's my song. It's mine, It's not Google's or whichever cloud service I want to host it at. It's not theirs. I don't want them to be able to look in it or change it or monetize it or sell it on or anything else. It's my work. And if I want to work with you on making that song, it should exist on both of our computers and be transmitted between our computers. It's ours, Like there's I don't know, it feels like some principle that just feels so obvious. And I don't know how I could possibly justify it. It feels axiomatic. I think a lot of people don't realize just how much, I don't know. I feel like I'm probably preaching to the converted with a crowd listening to this podcast, but we forget how much our computing experience is moderated by big corporations, like big companies. And I think that's really sad because our computers are amazing, like the computer sitting at your desk. Like I often think about this, that our computers are like 2 to 5 gigahertz, 2 to 5 billion things every second. Like, wow, like that's a lot of steps. And you can make those steps do anything you want. Like you can write any program, totally free in that regard. So we could make programs that do whatever, service whatever needs we want, that we'll be able to, we've got all the technology, we've got CRDTs, and we've got access to low-level networking primitives and all of this stuff. But I really want good software so that if I want to, like, I don't know, I want to make a diagram for a paper, that I've got good tools to do that with. And I want to just whatever it is, I've got a bunch of photos and I want to share. I've been getting into photography lately. I want to share my photos with my friends. I want to be able to just have software that lets me do that easily. Like I really want to have collaborative software. I want to be able to run a D&D campaign on a Wave or something that's Wave-like, where it's not like owned by Google's computers and we have to all agree to Google's terms of service to be able to continue having access to that. It should just be something that we can all access. And if I want to write some new custom software to help me run my D&D campaign, I want to be able to do that too and have it interact with the same data model as everything else.
So yeah, I fully agree. And I think often people who are not as comfortable yet in the local first bubble as we are, I think a lot of people kind of think like, okay, why does local first matter? Maybe if there's sort of this dystopian future where I can't trust the government, I can't trust the clouds, I'm like a persecuted minority, whatever it is, like, but it has people only assume local first to be like meaningful when when a dystopian future has already arrived. And I think sure, local first is very meaningful in that part, but that's not what I'm like. I'm optimist, so I don't anticipate a dystopian future. And so I'm not a prepper, etc. I'm not a local first prepper. I'm a local first player. Like I want to have more of like the the playful state of mind. Like I am so fortunate and privileged that I get to do what I love and still like make a living from it. And like my ideal day that I live each day is like that I had a day full of play basically. And for me, play here means like discovering things, like losing sleep over a hard problem, but then getting the joy out of solving that and having sort of my own agency over what I'm doing. And I think even like when a child plays, like a child is not told like now you have to build this thing, but it's their own agency to do what they feel like and pursue their own goals. And I think local first can enable that in a similar way how the web has lowered the bar so much and therefore increased the agencies of individuals. Like, and I think the same thing is happening right now with like AI assisted tools, where the barrier comes down even more for non-programmers to build things. It gives them agency, gives them ways to playfully build things. And I have the same hope for local first, that it brings down one of the big barriers, which is data management. And I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I feel like there's a bunch of ways that we could be building better software. And I just want all of my programs to be able to interoperate. If I'm editing a text document, I want to be able to be typing something in a text editing environment on my laptop. And then, I run out the door and I'm on a train and I just open it up my phone and I can keep on editing it. And I want all of my software to work like that. And I want there to be it's like on Unix, we have this sort of open file system. Any program can interact with a file system and edit files, which is great, except that the file system makes it really hard for two programs to edit a file at the same time and have anything meaningful come out at all. So most programs don't really interact with each other around the data unless one program sort of saves something and then another program opens it up later, and then you do something in that program and save something else out and then have something else open it. But with local first software, I want sort of like an ecosystem of all the programs on my computer to be interacting. And then I also want to be able to have programs on my computer and your computer interacting. I feel like that should just be really easy to do. Like it's something that should be out of the box. And if every programmer needs to re-implement and reinvent it from scratch, it's never going to happen. But it's something that could just be built into the system.
I like this way of thinking about it, since my primary goal for local first right now is like step one is make it super, super easy, bring down the barrier to build something meaningful for myself or a small group of people at all. But then step two, even wider vision, is like, okay, let's bring together those experiences and bring them together in a way that's not just sort of like a best effort kind of thing where like, oh yeah, export JSON over here, import over there, and like now it's like you only have people's last names or something, but at least there's some existence. But I think this is almost like a second chapter that will probably take a lot of effort, and we need the solid foundations first. But the price of local first can ultimately lead to data interop in the same way as like our brain doesn't work in silos, but our brain, like when the conversation I'm having with you, I'm taking some ideas away from that and maybe bring them to another conversation I have. So my brain is already that big data bus. And that is a promise that local first can fulfill.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And so I feel like there's that piece. And then the other piece is there's things that we have as software engineers that everyone should have. My girlfriend she uses there's a content management system that she uses at her work. And I have access to, because I'm a software engineer, I use Git. And with Git, I can have branches and I can have pull requests and I can see all of the changes and history of changes. We've built those tools for ourselves, and then we haven't built them for anyone else in any other industry. And that to me is totally crazy. It's like no one else, like we've kind of been really selfish as software engineers. It's
That's Seph's rule in the real world.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly right. Yeah. But with local first software, like with these primitives, with these different ways of approaching software, I feel like we can make a set of primitives that should allow any program to do that. Like I'm really happy with the Ink and Switch guys and the work that they're doing, the guys and gals. But there's also like, I feel like that should just be the standard set of primitives for most things I do. I want to be able to open up Photoshop and be editing a document and have some commit type thing. And if you're using a different image editing program, I should be able to share it with you and you can just open up the document too. And then if I want to write some script that's going to interactively make changes to the document that I'm editing, like the image I'm editing, I should be able to have a little program that just interacts with the same data model that both of these programs we're using can interact with. And it should let us, and then also have the change history, and we can look through the history of changes and see who did what, and we can have pull requests on a video editing session. If we're editing a video together, I want to be able to have a pull request on a different way that the edit comes together. Like all of those kind of things should just be built into the primitives of the software that we write and the software that we use. And, like I was talking to someone recently who was saying, he was like, oh, I don't know how to explain it to the programmers that people want all of these things. And I was like, oh, well, tell them, imagine if you didn't get to use Git and you went back to the world where it was like, blah, final 2, final, no, actually the real final version. This is actually the world that most people who aren't software engineers live in with most of the programs that they use today. In the best case, they've got something like Google Docs that, makes a little bait and switch where they have exactly the change control that Google allows you to have. And by the way, last I checked, Google's API for Docs doesn't actually give you the change history of a document. So, once Google's got that change history, it's locked away in their servers and you can't do anything with it or interact with it or even download it for yourself, which is a real pity. But we can just have programs and files living on our hard drives and edit them with other people and see the change history and do whatever we want to. And I want everyone to have that capacity. So yeah, like it's obvious, right?
Yeah, that's another great way to kind of think about the future. Like, what have we as programmers figured out, and how can we bring it? How can we reduce the distance of Seph's rule here, and how can we bring a lot of those things that for us are obvious into other programs? But I think that the reality is, it's not that some product manager hasn't thought of it. Product managers have it's almost like the peak of the iceberg meme. Only the stuff that's floating above the sea level, that is the stuff that was actually important enough and viable enough to build. The stuff underneath is not built yet. It was thought of, but it was just too hard and not meaningfully important enough to ship. And I think local first can bring down the cost of that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's not just too hard. It's even if they do it, they've done it just for their application. And so every application ends up with its own bespoke way to do change editing and change histories and everything else. And then none of them are collaborative. None of them are interoperable. Like what we really need is we need something like the file system where every program that exists can interact with some standard set of primitives. And then every program can take for granted that the file system exists and it sits underneath the program. And then if you have something like that, not only is it really easy for product managers to build these features into our applications, which I promise you, I agree with you. I've talked to a lot of them. They'd love it. They really want collaborative editing. Everyone wants this. So not only could they do it easily, but then all of the collaborative editing tools can all work together. They can all interoperate, which would just be so obviously great. Like it's some people like Vim and some people like Emacs and some people like something else. And why not have our documents able to be edited in all of those programs,
Yeah. So I'm so grateful that we got to explore all of those ideas that are clearly on your mind. And I'm also so grateful for everyone who's making that a reality. Particular shout out goes there to Ink and Switch. Anyone who's really defying the strategy of the commons for software. And I just want to see more of that. And I think a big step of that is step one is inspire people, open people's eyes of oh, we can do better. And yeah, so with that, I just want to thank you so much for your time, sharing all of that. We've already went quite extensive on this conversation. I feel like there is a lot of stuff that we should probably explore in a follow-up conversation, and we've already foreshadowed quite a bit of what the folks at Ink and Switch are brewing with Patchwork, etc. So I'm really looking forward to learning more about that as well. But yeah, maybe for the audience, if they want to see you in person, we're also planning the next Local First conference where, if everything works out, you might be a speaker as well. So happily invite everyone to come to Berlin at the end of May for the conference and to get a chance to talk to you in person as well.
I think that would be marvelous. And I really want to echo that. Thank you for all of the people that are doing the hard work. I feel like this is something that's complicated enough. We can't do it alone. And, one of the beautiful things about software that lets you do collaborative editing is we can collaborate on all of that. And
exactly. And it's even like a virtuous cycle where people working on that makes it easier to collaborate. So that's a very optimistic and hopeful vision for the future with many challenges ahead. But yeah, I want to end on a positive note. Seph, So thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom and thoughts with us here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. This is lovely, and I hope we have a chance to chat more in the future.
Thank you for listening to the Local First FM podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode and haven't done so already, please subscribe and leave a review. Please also share this episode with your friends and colleagues. Spreading the word about the podcast is a great way to support it and to help me keep it going. A special thanks again to Convex and Electric Sequels for supporting this podcast. See you next time.